do it. The sound is okay?
Welcome to Conversations with Barbara. I'm Barbara Kanellopoulos, and with me today is Dr. Chris Neal. He's a senior scientist at the Woodwell Climate Research Center, and we're going to talk about Falmouth and the environment. Welcome to the program, Chris.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm glad to be here.
Certainly, I know that when you're thinking about the environment in Falmouth, there's lots to be concerned about. And how do you see things? How do you evaluate what we're all seeing in Falmouth in terms of water quality and land use?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's take water quality for an example. You know, Falmouth has probably more bays and estuaries than any other single town in Massachusetts. Water plays this phenomenal role in our sort of civic sense of who we are, and yet we're really facing dramatic declines in water quality. And we know that primarily because we've been monitoring it carefully over the years. Personally, I'm involved in a monitoring program that's been going on since 1992 in Buzzards Bay. So we know that water clarity is decreasing, water, the amount of nitrogen in the water is increasing, and the amount of algae in the water bodies, in the water column and on the bottom of the estuaries is increasing. So that's leading to this cascading series of events that affects life, things like scallops, winter flounder, the loss of eelgrass. So those things can be documented. On the other hand, you know, when we started monitoring, things were already quite highly affected by, primarily in our case of water, the loading of nitrogen from land, from septic systems and other sources, fertilizers on land. So what we've been measuring is just sort of only a part of the overall decline that's happened in waters over the years. So as I was raising this issue with some of my colleagues about these shifting baselines, this is a concept that has been coined in the 1990s, and the idea is that our perceptions of what water quality is are based on a lot on our own eyes and ears and our own perceptions.
True. In your column, you speak about somebody coming from Boston who is coming here for the first time, and things look to that person to be perfectly natural.
Right, but somebody who grew up here, who went scalloping and clamming and fishing for flounder in the estuaries, realizes that there's been degradation. So you've got this dichotomy. There's a generation that sees it, generation that doesn't. And so what this idea of shifting baselines is we worry that our new generation will not see it as degraded as some of our data or our historical records indicate that it truly is. So that might lower expectations or interest in taking those actions to change things and clean things up.
Yes, like for example, being willing at town meeting to spend the money on sewering, for example. Is that the baseline if they don't really understand how serious it is because they don't see it? There isn't the political will.
Right, and the fear is that as folks get older and the population shifts, more people moving in from outside, that we lose that storyline that runs back to the clean water, to the conditions that were here when people who are now in their 60s and 70s, sort of grew up.
That's so interesting. You reminded me too that I've been in Falmouth for a long, long time, the 50s. And I do remember meeting a friend who did say, oh yeah, we were very near a pond, and he did say to me, oh, I used to fish for scallops and for my evening meal. And that's no longer the case, so I see what you're saying.
Yeah, so yeah, in a way, our ability to harvest the fisheries, for example, from our estuaries is somewhat of a shadow of its former self. This whole term about shifting baselines was coined regarding fisheries, actually. The idea that we're setting fisheries regulations based on populations that were already depleted. So why should we be shooting for a small increase from a low, a population low point? We should be shooting for returning to what we had before these stocks were fished down so dramatically.
Yes.
So it really determines sort of how we set goals for environmental protection and cleanup. So that's why I think it's an important concept. And I'm a scientist, so I'm always interested in data. I work with long-term data. But on the other hand, if you go back beyond when some of these historical records started, for example, our record of water quality that I do with the Buzzards Bay Coalition in Buzzards Bay goes back to the early 90s. But before that, we have to rely on other metrics. And so for some populations of animals, for example, there are historical observations, there are historical records and diary entries and things like that provide us clues. And we have to be willing to use those, I think, in our thinking about what things were. Yes, they don't match up. We can't say the method was exactly the same as we'd use today with our modern technology. But we have to, but best interpretation is that these populations were much higher.
So even when it comes to things like having a metric for how much nitrogen loading is permitted, even that becomes kind of iffy. Is that what you...
Well, they're based mostly on models, on estimates that are validated by certain measurements in certain places and then applied more generally. And so I'll give you a little story about the nitrogen models and this idea of a shifting baseline. So for years with our environmental science class, a semester in environmental science at MBL that I taught in, we would do an exercise with the students who were there in the fall, and we'd ask them to model the nitrogen loads to some of Falmouth's ponds, like Wacoit Bay or Great Pond or Little Pond or West Falmouth Harbor is a favorite place of ours to model. And we can calculate based on the number of houses and the number of nitrogen that each person puts out and the deposition from the acid rain coming down from the atmosphere that has nitrogen in it. We'd calculate the total load of nitrogen to these estuaries and what it is today and which sources are contributing what. So that's what the model allows you to do. And then you can play. You can kind of dial and turn the knobs and say, well, how would you reduce it? But one of the interesting things you can do is you can go back and say, well, what if there were no houses? What was the historical situation? What was the load from the watershed? And we might calculate a load today that's in the tens of thousands of kilograms per year of nitrogen coming to the estuary. We calculate the historical load and it's 120. So we're very, very, very far beyond whatever that historical baseline was. We're not going to get back to that baseline by sewering or something. We can reduce it to a point where the estuary was in much, much better shape. But I like this idea of historical baseline because it just puts in perspective how far away, how much impact humans have had on the environment. And so we do use these different methods of getting at that question.
I would imagine, too, that for the public to know that it indicates the kind of real urgency that things are really, they're not just bad, they're very bad. And do you think that's important for people to understand?
I think it is. I think that perspective is interesting. And in some ways, our waters are not as impaired as some other waters in major cities where wastewater treatment is much less sophisticated, for example, or where overhunting has decimated populations to a greater extent than they have in, say, the northeast of the U.S. But at the same time, I think it's a very important perspective to have. We have a lot to save if we work at it. That's always my perspective.
I wondered if you'd want to address some of the things that are going on in Falmouth, especially. It seems logical. We have sewering, and we have new work being done, and these new septic systems, denitrification, and so and there's also urine diverting toilets, which makes a lot of sense. Why not go to the source? But I think, is it that we're expecting technology to solve these problems, and we're not?
I think that, actually, I believe that technology has, especially on the denitrifying systems, even though the technology doesn't have to necessarily be that complicated, I think it's come a long way in the last even less than a decade. I think those will be a major part of our solutions town-wide. Town isn't dense enough in some sections, especially sort of the northern sections, to sewer everywhere. So I think those we'll need now. The DEP, Mass Department of Environmental Protection, has instituted new regulations that will require Falmouth to develop plans for each of its watersheds to remove the amount of nitrogen to get us back to at least the sort of the 1960 baseline, not the 1860 baseline.
Gosh.
But I think those are very promising and will have to be a much greater part of any solution than they are at the moment. I think expanded sewering is absolutely part of this solution. I had my differences with the Water Quality Management Committee over exactly how much nitrogen should be discharged to the Herring Brook estuary. I thought they could have developed a plan to take all the new nitrogen out that they would put in this plan that the town voted, but on the whole, absolutely, we need to move ahead with sewering.
I gather your view is that it's not just one method. We need many coming together, although urine diverting toilets, it may be a good beginning.
Oh, I think treating this at the I'm much more favorably inclined to argue that we should be removing nitrogen at the source than sort of soaking it up as it hits the shoreline of the estuary with other metrics, with other methods that have all their own issues, even if they work in some cases. So I think that's worth. I think Falmouth went down a good road with doing a demonstration project, trying to get people to sign up. I think one of the big issues is just acceptance. Will people retrofit their houses? I think if your house is retrofitted, you're going to use it. It's just making the decision. We did that with composting toilets in town. Had a pilot project. There wasn't a lot of uptake about 10 years ago, and so this is another attempt at this. I think the folks who are arguing that we need to do source diversion and even resource recovery for the materials that are in our wastes are making a really excellent point.
Yeah, it's a good beginning. We are creatures of habit, but you know, habits are changed. I sometimes think to myself, there was a time when everyone smoked, and that changed. So that makes me think that people habits can change.
Yeah, and we just have to look for those points where things can shift without creating enormous financial burdens on people to implement and you know, honestly, you're looking at a lot of people who've accrued an awful lot of value in their properties in Falmouth in the last decades, and so there is an opportunity to do that, I think. So that's that's where we stand. So I'm hopeful on the wastewater, even though we have a long way to go.
I think that's. I agree. I think there's reason to be hopeful. I think sometimes when you look at town meeting over the years, I remember way back in the 20s, the possibility of sewering. Absolutely no interest, no. And then a few years later, still, we have this series of no sewering.
Well, there was this link between sort of sewering and enabling higher housing density. And I think we've come a long way on that, because we desperately need housing, and the way to build housing is to build dense housing, with smaller living spaces, even for people who need to live here, and do that on already paved over, already dense places is the best place to put it. And those places, if we can make those connected to a sewer system, that'll help. So I think, anyway, I think those things we're moving forward in some good directions.
Yes, yes. I suppose baseline expectations might even apply to this issue of density, what people would accept as natural, and how they would look at how things were and how things are today.
Well, yeah, Falmouth is hugely different than what it was in the even in the 1980s. But I think we just have to, we just have to accept some increased density in some places. The trick is how you do that fairly and how you do that while coupling, you know, not just increasing density, but coupling that to preservation of natural spaces around.
Yes.
So can we talk a little bit about shifting baselines and climate?
Yes, yes.
So I work at the Woodwell Climate Research Center, and our focus is largely connected to ecosystems always, but you know how changing climates are affecting ecosystems and including up to the global scale. But here's just an example of how the baselines have shifted on climate. You know, we live in one of the fastest warming places in the world. The ocean off our coast in the Gulf of Maine is warming about as fast as the ocean is warming anywhere. And you know, we measure that in Buzzards Bay, and it's about 1.5 degrees increase in the summer per decade. And you know, you add that up over 30, 40 years, and it's a pretty big measurable change. But this time of year is when I always think you see the impacts the greatest, because our winters are getting so much warmer than they were historically. I mean, people who moved here when I did, I moved here in 1989, there was skating on ponds for a lot of the winter. And now we don't, it's mid-January, we don't even have ice on any of the freshwater ponds to speak of. So it's been a very dramatic change, and that sort of cascades through all kinds of effects on life and birds and all the other things that people, and I especially, care about. So that to me has been a dramatic change. I was just doing some Christmas bird counts, which I enjoy doing every year. And I was looking, the Christmas bird counts are great because they are one of these metrics that goes back. And the ones in Cape Cod started in the 1930s. The earliest one is out and covers the area of Orleans and Chatham and Brewster and Eastham, which I've done every year. And the one Martha's Vineyard goes back almost as far to the 1930s. But they record, as well as all the birds seen, they record the temperature, the high temperature during the day of those bird counts.
Great.
So in the so I looked at the record for Martha's Vineyard as I was about to set out to do the Martha's Vineyard bird count until COVID knocked me down. And then, and I looked in the first years through the 30s and into the 40s, and even through about 1960, the high temperature, the day of the bird count, which always occurred between Christmas and New Year's for the vineyard, was in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. So cold, right? The last 2 decades, that temperature has been in the 40s or even in the low 50s. Now that's an absolute, you know, there's variability around that, but there was this absolutely dramatic change in the temperature in the sort of early winter period.
And then the bird count, birds no longer.
So what we're seeing is the influx of southern birds into Falmouth and New England, and there's been this progression of southern birds marching north over the years, and I'll tell a shifting baseline story about that too. But there's been an out movement, that a lack of the northern birds, winter birds, coming down to escape the harshest cold winters north of us. And those are things like winter finches, like purple finches and evening grosbeaks and things like that, even red-breasted nuthatches to some extent. So birds that come from the boreal forest down into our zone, to seek a slightly milder winter have been failing to show up, and birds from the south have been coming north.
Oh, that's so interesting, that link to the temperature.
It's driven by
yes,
temperature and
yes.
climate. So one of the, I think that's about the, in my personal experiences, that's about the clearest link. But talk about shifting baselines, right? You think, everybody in Falmouth thinks they go out and they look at their bird feeder, you're going to see cardinals and tufted titmice. You go back to 1940, there were no cardinals and tufted titmice in Falmouth. That's a baseline that shifted. They were southern, they had southern distributions, and they've moved north. Red-bellied woodpeckers are another one, came in the 1990s, now they're in northern New Hampshire. But they weren't here. The first nesting in Massachusetts of red-bellied woodpeckers was on Fay Road in Falmouth, you know, in the late 80s. They'd been seen, but they hadn't nested. And so anyway, that's just an example of these, and there are just more examples coming. Fish crows, a southern species that's shown up even more recently.
Well, that concept certainly does, it really does make people much more aware. If I were feeding those birds, I wouldn't know that they were birds I wouldn't know. I think these are the birds that have always come here.
Exactly. That's the idea,
Yes.
is that the things are shifting.
Yeah.
Now, it's okay, so I have no objections to having those birds around. I think they're in some ways a nice addition to our fauna, but they are reflective of these changes that we're seeing. And
are they not, the birds themselves are predictors of climate change? I mean, it seems to me that there would be the presence or absence of certain birds are signs to us that the climate is changing.
I think they're just, they're a symptom of warmer temperatures, milder winters. A great example is this little brown bird called the Carolina wren, which has a loud voice, and I'm sure you could hear in almost every yard in Falmouth, and especially in the spring, but even now. And those are southern birds that moved in a little bit later than cardinals and titmice, but they're everywhere here. But they really, you know, they struggle with the coldest winters, and they rely on feeders less than cardinals and titmice. So those can get through the roughest winters because of feeders, and there's some indication people feeding birds ties into these changes. But wrens are a little bit decoupled from that, and so every time there's a really harsh winter, their populations go down. But their populations sort of go up and up. They go up, they get knocked back. They go up higher, they get knocked back. And so they're increasing over time. And to me, that's a great example of a bird that's kind of limited by cold temperatures. The cold temperatures are less than they used to be. The bird's population is increasing. So very, very clear sign.
Are you a fan of the work that the Cornell lab is doing? It seems to me people are able, it's quite miraculous. You can go to your internet and find out all kinds of information about this.
Yeah.
Are you
absolute fan?
Good stuff.
I'm an absolute fan of this. But the program they've developed is called eBird, and it's a crowdsourced way of recording bird populations developed by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And I'm a Cornell graduate, so I really am. I'm glad that Cornell is leading this. They have been for years. But it's a way of, it's an app on your phone or computer, and you can walk around, you can press start a bird list, and you can walk around and tap on all the different birds and the numbers you're seeing, and then that list gets recorded at Cornell, and it becomes a record, and it's geolocated because your phone has a GPS on it.
Excellent.
So you know that there have been X birds recorded. So what can you do with this? There have been hundreds and hundreds of papers published with these data now, and you can make these maps, and you can watch the wave of spring migration of South American species come across the continent almost in real time. And you know, that record has only been going for, I don't know how long eBird's been around, but less than 20 years from its earliest incarnations. But over time, that will provide data on change.
Oh, I see.
And,
Yes,
and
of
so
course.
ultimately, you know, because thousands and thousands of people are putting, you can sit on your computer at night and watch the counter of the number of lists submitted each day all over the world just go up and up and up.
Okay.
It's absolutely fabulous.
I know you said earlier that you're a data guy. You must love it.
I don't tend to work with the eBird data. I work with some people
Yes,
who do,
yeah.
especially around this idea of trying to make backyards more amenable to different species of birds. But I love the concept. It's really led the charge for this crowdsourcing of biodiversity monitoring. And I wrote about this in a recent column in the Enterprise as an example. The neat thing is that that's spreading now to other areas of natural history. So people are recording plants and recording where those are, and they're recording insects through, and there's a wonderful program called iNaturalist that comes out of California Academy of Sciences. And it provides the same opportunity. You can set up a page, and it's like eBird is curated in the sense that if I reported some really weird bird, somebody would flag it. The computer first, but then somebody would look at it and say, you know, Chris, I just don't believe you saw that bird. And so there's some level of quality control. It's not absolutely perfect, but there's an intention to have it be curated at some level, as are these other lists. So there's expert botanists who are verifying the pictures that get submitted with these things.
So with plants, possibly trees, of course.
Yeah, trees are easy compared with some of the other plants, right? To compare with, try doing grasses.
That's very exciting. So that baselines, to end our talk with that, it seems to me that we will be creating some, or assuming that, well, I'm not certain that what, but this is collecting the data that will help people understand where we were and what's happening, where we're going.
And these new tools are extremely exciting. Coming back to water just for a moment, I'm involved in a project with some folks at Woodwell, the Buzzard Bay Coalition, and University of Massachusetts, in which we are going to put out oxygen sensors in a series of estuaries around the Buzzards Bay region and look at the opportunities and the challenges of switching from just going out and grabbing water samples to actually automating and having continuous collections with lots of data, you know, to look at not only the changes over time, if one can keep this going for years, but also the dynamics on a shorter time frame that help us understand the influences on water quality. So we're in a very exciting time because the price of these things, the accessibility of these things is coming down, and so the ecologists of the future who will sit in my shoes at Woodwell, and in fact already we're hiring people with more computer skills and more data more data analysis skills to take advantage of this sort of flood of data that's coming in on this. But the trick will be to keep it going, keep society invested in making those measurements.
Yes.
And then, you know, we'll use that to be able to show the data, but also I'm never going to give up on the power of telling stories about how things have changed, because those actually also help resonate with people and make people finally demand change.
Yes, exactly. It's both exciting and encouraging. So I thank you very much. It's been fascinating, and certainly something that to give our viewers much food for thought. So thank you very much for being here.
You're very welcome.
I will look forward to reading your articles in the Enterprise. Keep on writing them. They're fascinating. And viewers, thank you very much for tuning in. I look forward to seeing you next time on Conversations with Barbara.